It is a great honor to introduce our next speaker, fellow classmate from 2017, and DJ Kessinger. He was born in Parkersburg. He's lived there most of his childhood, and now he is working with the church in Purcellville Church of Christ in Purcellville, Virginia. He's a graduate of 2017 of the school. And I could go on a lot of different things with DJ. I'm going to just say he's one of the boldest preachers I know, speaking to our class about gluttony. He ran after that chapel lesson. He can also does a very good job of speaking without any distractions. And so he is going to bring us a lesson from 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, commit these things.
You know, when I gave that lesson on gluttony, I think I really ended up teaching myself a more important lesson, which is just sometimes your sermons are going to fall on deaf ears. Do me a favor, raise your hand if you've been a Christian for longer than 10 years. And I kind of figured that might be a case. Keep them raised if you've been a Christian longer than 20 years. Still good, Matt. How about 30? 40? Ma'am, you're not even 40 years old. Put your hand down. Now, I kind of suspected this might be the case. Being in a room that has so many people who have been Christians for a very long time, chances are I'm preaching to the choir. And I like preaching to the choir because there are sermons that the choir's got to hear too. And unfortunately, I'm not always the most qualified one to do it, and I don't care. I get to do it anyway. 2 Timothy chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, the Bible reads, "Thou therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Jesus Christ, and these things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also." Here's another reason I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit. I'm guessing because of your presence here, you're probably in favor of entrusting the things which we learn from the Bible to faithful men. This is, after all, for the West Virginia School of Preaching. If you're not in favor of teaching people the Bible, what on earth are you doing here? Nevertheless, I do think there are a few things that we can learn about how we are to teach one another from this. And a few places where we could probably do a little bit better. A few places where we might have a few failings that we need to work on a little bit. And I don't mean anybody as an individual, but we as the church, perhaps. A few places that we can do a little better on these things. Certainly, it is necessary for all of us to recognize the importance of teaching what we know to others. Yes, of course, everything we are teaching is coming from an ultimate source. That's the basis of everything. Nevertheless, personal experience, the things that we have learned about the Bible over the years, it helps to teach others. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on this one, but how many people were baptized with no help from anybody else? You just picked up the Bible, figured out what you were supposed to do, and you found your closest Church of Christ and were baptized. Chances are that's not how it happened. See, we need to guide each other a little bit on these things. Yes, our ultimate authority for all things is the Bible, but we need help in understanding those things. We need to be able to use the experience of others. And we as Christians, and by the way, if you didn't notice, just about everybody in the room raised their hand when I asked who's been a Christian for longer than 10 years. That's a fairly experienced Christian then. We need to be able to entrust the things that we know to others as well. I know you're going to be shocked, but I have 3 points concerning this. The first of which is the beginning of where we entrust to others, which is we have to have a certain amount of knowledge ourselves. Confidence without competency is useless. Confidence without competency is useless. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is, we as a culture love these stories of somebody who is arrogant, thinks they know more than they do, and as a result is overconfident in themselves and then fails spectacularly. We all have our own personal anecdotes, I'm sure, about those things. And yet it's really easy for us to neglect to make sure we know what we're talking about before we start talking with somebody else. And the solution to this is pretty simple. Well, what do you have to do? It can be found in the same chapter of 2 Timothy. In 2 Timothy chapter 2 in verse 15, the Bible reads, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." Now the word study there is used in a way that we don't use it so commonly today. Normally when we see study in this, and if you're reading a more modern version than the King James, it might just say something along the lines of be prepared. Usually when we talk about study, we mean just reading. And that's certainly an important part of it. And this is why I use that verse, because you're going to have to do that part of studying too. But there's more to it. It isn't just reading the Bible. It isn't just looking at it and, as we might say, looking at it as a man who intently studies his own reflection in the mirror and then immediately forgets what kind of man he was when he walks away. No, it's more than just that. It's reading about it. It's trying to understand it. It's thinking about it. It's trying to put it into practice. Think about the terminology that God uses in the Old Testament when He's telling people what to do with this. You get to the end of the books of the law, He starts giving commands like, take these words, bind them as a sign on your wrist, as a sign on your forehead. Put them on your doorpost. Talk about them daily. Of course, we know that there were some among the Jews who took that very literally and began literally wearing those things on their wrists and their forehead. Did he mean that literally? No. He meant this is something that needs to be on your mind at all times. Does that apply in the New Testament? Well, certainly. We need to have a knowledge of the Bible, and we need to be able to study it regularly in all ways. And we live in a time right now where our excuses for not doing so are just non-existent. You know, you think, go back 1,000 years, chances are you wouldn't be literate. If you were, chances are you wouldn't have access to a Bible. Go back a few hundred years. You might be literate, and you might be lucky enough to have a Bible. That's all you got. In fact, even if you go back just a couple of decades, yeah, you'd have access to a Bible in your language, which is a blessing on its own. But that's all. Think about what we have right now. You know, a lot of bad things happen because of the pandemic. One good thing I'm extremely grateful for is a lot of congregations started recording their services and putting them online. I used to joke that I became a preacher because I can't stand preachers and now I don't have to listen to them anymore. But personally, that was something I kind of missed out on, was getting to really learn from people as much as I still, of course, get the Bible classes and I appreciate that, but I didn't get to hear as many sermons anymore. Well, suddenly after this pandemic, everyone's putting up their sermons. Helped me out a lot. We have more tools at our disposal now to learn the Bible. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of places where you could go wrong with that. The technology sort of cuts both ways on that. But there's more tools at our disposal right now to learn the Bible, to understand the Word of God than there has ever been. Save perhaps direct inspiration. And we are without excuse. Do you have a commute? And you got time to listen to the Bible. You got time to listen to someone preaching about the Bible. Do you have time to yourself? You got time to read the Bible. You got time to read what somebody has said about the Bible. Like we said, there's more to studying than just reading. You got to think. You got to be able to separate because, not everything everybody always says is going to be right. You're going to have to be able to separate those things. But once you do, we have an ability to learn like never before. Which makes it so sad that, at least in recent memory, we might be more ignorant of the Bible than we ever have been. I'm not even talking about the church right now, I'm just talking about society in general. You don't believe me? Watch Jeopardy sometime and wait for a Bible category to show up. For 1,000 This woman in the book of Genesis was the wife of Adam. That's a real stumper, I don't know. But here's the thing. We can't judge ourselves based upon the knowledge that the world has about it. We can only judge ourselves based upon our own personal improvement. And we can't make very tiny little improvements over a very long period of time. We got to be striving to be the very best with this. We got to treat it as a skill. We have to treat it as something that is a discipline that we need to work hard for, because it is. But the Bible sets a pretty high standard for us. For those of us who have been Christians for some time, for example, did you know the Bible does give you an example of something you probably should at least have a little bit of familiarity with? Look at Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5, beginning in verse 10. Called of God and high priest after the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have many things to say, and hard to be uttered, seeing ye are dull of hearing. For the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as we have need of milk, and not of strong meat. For everyone that useth milk is unskilled in the world of righteousness, for he is a babe. But strong meat belongeth to them that are full of age, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. For a moment, the Hebrews writer there mentions a man by the name of Melchizedek. Does that name sound familiar to you? My point from it is this. The Hebrews writer very offhandedly mentions this is a benchmark of knowledge. He says, I'm mentioning Melchizedek, and I know for a fact that many of you have no idea who I'm talking about, and that's a problem. You should know by now. We're past the milk of the word. This is the strong meat, and you should have at least a little bit of the strong meat. I'm not here to try to stomp on anybody's toes about how well we know more Bibles. It'd be a hypocrite for me to say, I'd be a hypocrite to say I have a perfect knowledge of the Bible. In fact, just to prove it, I had my Bible opened to 2 Timothy, and I said we need to go over to Hebrews. My first instinct was to turn the wrong way, so I'd be a hypocrite if I was telling you that I have that perfect knowledge of the Bible, but it's something we need to strive for. If that name Melchizedek didn't even ring a bell for you, we need to keep pushing. And obviously that's going to depend. That's not my expectation for somebody who was just baptized within the year, for example, unless it happened to be taught to them fairly recently. But it's something we need to strive for. Yes, Melchizedek is especially if you don't know about his New Testament context, he can seem like an obscure character within the Old Testament. We need to know the obscurities of the Bible as well. We ought to be striving for that knowledge, and that's a standard we need to set for ourselves. Everyone who has done something great has set themselves a high standard so that they can reach it. We need to have that kind of discipline in our own study before we can entrust these words to faithful men. Confidence without competency is useless. At the same time, competency without confidence is also useless. This is a little bit less intuitive. This is something we don't always see as much. But you often have the exact opposite problem of somebody who has no idea what they're talking about but is arrogant about it and will continue to speak and then make a fool of themselves. We hear those stories all the time. We don't hear the stories as much about somebody who did know what they were talking about, who did put in the discipline to understand the things that they ought to understand, but still couldn't accomplish it because they didn't have the confidence, they didn't have the boldness to do what had to be done. This is what I'd like to emphasize in this lecture, the idea of now that we know something, what are we going to do with it? Well, the answer is fairly simple. We need to teach. Even, by the way, if you didn't have your hand raised when I said if you've been a Christian for over 10 years, teaching ought to be a goal of ours. There are a few ideas that I have seen within the church which are very rarely explicitly said, but you can kind of tell people are a little bit are thinking in that way, especially, for example, among brand new Christians. Well, I'm brand new, I don't have anything to offer among this group. Well, yeah, you do. No, maybe you don't know the ins and outs of the Bible. That doesn't mean you don't have anything to offer. Very common one I see among new Christians, new converts. Well, I'm not ready to conduct a Bible study. Well, why not? What are you worried about? Well, I don't know enough. Well, when you were baptized, you knew enough what you had to do, didn't you? Well, yeah, but I know that's what the Bible says, but I don't know where it says it. Do you have Google? Let me tell you, there's Google. Google is about the worst commentary of the Bible you could imagine, but if you need to find out where a verse is, you can do it within 2 words and it'll tell you exactly what you're looking for. And if you got a brain like mine, where you have an easier time remembering what it says, but have a very difficult time remembering where it says it, Google is your best friend. Well, what if they see me Googling it? Are you afraid they're going to find out that you're not speaking from your own authority, but you're speaking from the authority of the Bible instead? Now, the truth is, we're capable of doing a whole lot more than we think we are. However, that puts to shame some of us who have not made that a goal for ourselves, to teach others, to mentor others, to take what we have and add it to the collective knowledge of the church. Can I tell you something strange? I have experienced a lot of new converts to the church who are very quick to try to speak to somebody else. Very quick to want to have Bible studies. And as I mentioned, they might not always be so confident in themselves, and they might need a little boosting. You might need to push them a little bit. But they want to have them. They see their friends and they see their family. And in times where it might be a little bit harder to have those conversions, that's where you got to go to first. In fact, that's always where we had to go to first, but especially in these times. And they say, I want to help. I see a lot more of that from new converts than people who have been Christians for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. I realize it's anecdotal. And I realize there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. I'm certainly not talking about everybody under that. Not every new convert's going to be as gung-ho for Christianity. Not every more experienced Christian is going to be apathetic. But it's strange to me that I see so many new converts acting as the stronger brother. We worry a lot about the weaker brother and the stronger brother. I see those who are newer, who ought to be the weaker ones, putting to shame those who have been Christians for a long time. Maybe not from their knowledge, but from what their desire clearly is, from where their heart clearly is. I don't know what it is. Perhaps it's hard to remain zealous after decades. But I also kind of think it might have something to do with what Paul was telling Timothy back in our scripture in 2 Timothy 2:2, when he's talking about entrusting these things to faithful men. How well are we really teaching each other? Because actually, I've been using the word teach, but that's not what he says. There's a few things that are sort of understood by the word teach, right? We all have a responsibility to be teachers in some way or another, but the way I've been talking about it is teaching in the way I am right now for the most part. Well, that's not for everybody. In fact, James chapter 3, verse 1 tells us that it really isn't for everybody. Brethren, be not many masters. Why is that? Because we're going to have a stricter judgment. Instead, everyone needs to be a teacher of a sort. Maybe you're not somebody who, for whatever reason, is capable of preaching or teaching in a public manner such as this. Does that excuse you from teaching at all? Absolutely not. In fact, I hate to be the one to tell you this, if you're not a preacher, you might have the harder job than a preacher when it comes to what you ought to be teaching, because it's not so straightforward. I know if I'm doing a good job teaching because I'm teaching. A little bit harder to know if you're doing a good job of teaching through your example, or if you're teaching those things which are not so immediately obvious as to be relevant to the work of the church. But I have been taught a good many things by others, and it wasn't in the form of a sermon. The New Testament does not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. But ever since I became a man, do you think that there has been no woman in the church that has taught me anything? I'll tell you what, I'd be in pretty sorry shape if that were true. There are ways for that to be done. So, we need to say to ourselves, I'm going to study the law. I'm going to love the law. David said in Psalm 119, "Oh, how I love your law." Why do we love the law? Well, John said in 1 John chapter 5, it's because his commandments are not burdensome. That's a difference, by the way. I'm going a little bit off on a tangent, but it's worth it. That's a difference between the law of man and the law of God, by the way. Every single law of God was made with your good in mind. You cannot go through the Bible and point, and this is something that while we are immature, we tend to view the Bible as something that restricts us. It stops us from doing things that are good for ourselves, but as we mature, we realize that all of these things are good for us. Did you know that there isn't a single, for example, New Testament act of worship that doesn't have an immediate benefit towards the worshiper? Now, some people take this too far and say, well, then the whole point of it should be for the benefit of the worshiper, and then you bring other things. No, the purpose is to worship God, but there are side benefits on every single one of them, and usually it has to do with teaching. Obviously, with the act of teaching, that's direct. Singing does the exact same thing. It activates a different part of your brain. It helps you learn better. Even when we are giving, we are learning not to depend on the things of the world, but we're learning to depend on God. Look through the law of the land sometime and tell me with a straight face that every single law on that book was made for the purpose of your well-being. You know, my wife and I disagree about homeowners associations. She's in favor of them in general, and in general I'm in favor of liberty, democracy, America. If I've never been a part of an HOA, but I've heard enough horror stories to know I never want to be. And I bet you we can find someone who's got a few of them if you don't believe me. Now, we need to study that law, we need to love the law, we need to live that law. But as we say, competence without confidence is not enough. Now that we know what we need to do with it, we need to teach. We need to teach others, and it's not just the things that are the basics of the law. It's not good enough. It's just the same as it's not good enough for ourselves to have only milk. It's not good enough to teach only the milk to others. We got to teach them the difficult things too. And we have to teach them how to do difficult things. That's one of the things that's being done at the School of Preaching. Men are being taught how to do difficult things, but it should not be only within our schools of preaching where people are finally taught the difficult things. I mentioned that sometimes it seems that the weaker Christians are the ones who have been Christians for decades. I think part of the reason for that is because they haven't been challenged for decades. Do you know how much of a discouragement it is to a Christian when they know how to do something and are never given that opportunity? Do you know that part of the design of the church is that everybody is going to have a part to play? Preachers, let me ask you a couple things about your congregations. If you baptize somebody new, do you try to find a part for them to play? I'm preaching against myself here, by the way, because that's a failing that I've had in my ministry. Do you try to find a part for them to play? Everybody in the congregation, by the way, do you try to find, and it might be that they don't want to have a part to play in the congregation, that's their own personal problem. But a lot of times there are people within our congregations who don't feel they are doing enough and they don't find any opportunity to do more. Yes, we know there are always ways you can do more. But why do we make it difficult on people? When you baptize someone, find a way for them. And this is a great thought, by the way, that we think of the church as a great place for them to receive support and give them all these things. Keep doing that. But we know that nobody's attitude within the church ought to be, how much can it give to me? Teach them how to give back to the church. And it should not have to take places outside of the church for that to happen. You know where I learned most of, and by the way, this wasn't true of my home congregation, thankfully. I had many mentors who taught me a lot back at Dewey Avenue when I was growing up there. And I've had many mentors outside. I've had many mentors at West Virginia Christian Youth Camp, had many mentors at the School of Preaching. It shouldn't take places like that for people to find that sense of purpose within the church. We got a real problem in the church of people being baptized and then never seeing them again. Maybe if we have a little bit more responsibility for those people, maybe that could help with that. That's all I'd like to suggest with that. But that requires something on our part that we might not always be willing to do. It requires that we trust people. And that's difficult. Especially for people who have been doing difficult work for a long time. It's difficult to trust somebody else to take over those works. Or at least some portion of those works. But think how many good things. Think in your experience in the church. How many good things have come to you from the church and it was all the result of one person? I've known a great many great people within the church. And not a single one of them has accomplished anything of any particular note that I can remember completely by themselves. And then, of course, if you take out any sort of help they might have had along the way, then I can guarantee you it's never happened. We need to be able to trust each other. Trust each other with the difficult things of the Word, the difficult works of the church. But what if they fail? Well, that's the wrong question. The question is, what do we do when they fail? And the answer, most of the time, seems to me to be nothing. Give them another chance. Let them work it out for themselves. Most people who are in the church, I'm convinced, do not have malicious or apathetic intent. I'm convinced that most people in the church want to see the church grow and prosper, and they want to see as many people in the world become members of the church. They just don't always know how. They don't always have the confidence in themselves. And sometimes they're just never given that opportunity. Let's give each other that opportunity. Let's give each other that trust. Of course, the phrasing that we saw in 2 Timothy chapter 2 was entrust these things to faithful men. But the term men there, it's not talking about the male sex. That's talking about humanity. Now certainly, the particular role that was being talked about by Paul to Timothy was something that was only for men. But the broader concept, the greater idea that we need to entrust the work of the church to each other, it remains the same. Do you think it would have been easy for Timothy to trust those men, by the way? Do you know why Timothy was at Ephesus at that time? He was there to correct a bunch of false doctrine that they were dealing with. How long would it take you, preachers, if you were sent into a denomination and you managed to convert them away from denominationalism and have them become the church? How long would it take you to start trusting these men? Unfortunately, I can't give you a concrete answer on how fast it should be, but by what Paul wrote to Timothy, I think it might be faster than we think. That means we got to work hard. That means we got to deal with a little bit of heartbreak. We got to deal with a little bit of stress. But the church is designed so that it works together in perfect harmony. We cannot become arrogant and say to ourselves, I'm the only one who's going to keep making this thing work. That's foolishness. Never was designed that way. If we want to see the church succeed, and the church will succeed, we need to say to ourselves, I'm going to take it as a personal responsibility to understand the word of the Bible, to understand the words of life. I'm going to take it as a personal responsibility to see that as many other people as possible know these things as well, however my role may be for it. And then I'm going to have to do a really difficult thing, and I'm going to have to let somebody else take charge on occasion. That happens repeatedly with Timothy. Do you think it might be difficult, for example, for Timothy to appoint elders? It's a difficult thing to trust other people to do the things they ought to do. But we need to start trusting in one another. Despite our flaws, we need to be able to work with one another, and instead of only pointing out each other's weaknesses, use our strengths to supplement each other's weaknesses. Instead of growing more arrogant with time, grow more humble with time. Instead of growing more apathetic with time, growing more zealous with time. That is the design of the church, and that's where we ought to be going for. I thank you very much for your attention.